in verse 25, notice, he quotes Hosea 2:23. And he says, this quote, I will call those who were not my people, what will I call them? My people, and her who was not my beloved, I shall call her what? My beloved. Paul is saying that the promises are going to be given to us. A different Israel. A spiritual Israel, if you would. You see, with Paul's people, and Paul understands it well because he said, in other places, he said, I am a true what? Israelite. I was the best, right? I was the best. The best in what? Well, the best in the way you feel about God. In verses 30 through 32, Paul is presenting two different ways of feeling toward God. There was the Jewish way. The aim of the Jew was to set himself right with God. His view was that he could set himself right with God by strict obedience to the law. That's what made you right with God. A right relationship with God was something that could be earned, the good Jew would say. Paul once said that. And so the Jewish idea was that a person, by strict obedience to the law, could in the end accumulate a credit balance with God. When he had acquired this credit balance, the result was that God was now in debt to him. God owed him salvation. It was a good Jewish thought. Of course, those thoughts have all disappeared and you don't find them any place anymore. I have found some of those thoughts still present in our church. God, you owe me. God, I did this and this and this, and you said if I do that, I'd have salvation, so now you what? You owe me. Oh, Pastor, I did all these things. I followed all this list here that our church upholds, and now I got cancer. What is God doing? I followed all the health directives, and now I got cancer. Why did God do this to me? After all, He owes me. A good Jewish law. In debt. God in debt. Paul is trying to counter this idea. Notice what he says in verse 3 of chapter 10. He said, this Jewish thought, for not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to what? The righteousness of God. The Jew tried to put God in his debt. You owe me, God. The Gentile was content to be in God's debt. In debt to God, instead of God in debt to him. Two different thoughts. Two different ideas. The Jew had the zeal to be right with God. Well, what does verse 2 of chapter 10 say? What about that zeal? It wasn't according to what? Knowledge. It wasn't according to the plan of salvation. The knowledge. Their zeal. And zeal is not enough when you're wrong about your knowledge. So Paul said it. And so, the stone, and this is all in these 3 chapters, the stone that was to provide salvation by faith became a stumbling block to the Jew, but a foundation stone for the Gentile. Same stone. And we could go into all those illustrations that he uses there, but we haven't got time to do that. And having said all this, now Paul tells us, though, that there is still hope for Israel. He said there's still hope for Israel. Notice verse 9 and 13. And if you confess your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be what? Saved. He says there's still hope for Israel. And verse 13, for whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be what? Saved. There's still hope for Israel. He still affirms in chapter 11, verse 2, God has not rejected His people whom He foreknew. He says God hasn't rejected Israel. Even, as He says in verse 5, if it is still just a remnant, God still hasn't rejected Israel, even if it's a small group. He still hasn't rejected. Now there's an important illustration that he calls up in this chapter. Notice verse